Greetings and welcome. I am JustaVOR, bringing you what I hope is constructive information on what the system of white supremacy, racism, is, and how it works, as well as what can be done to replace it with a system of justice. Even more tactics suspected racists use. In this video, we will cover even more tactics suspected racists use when in common contact with their non-white victims. These tactics are in addition to the primary tactics covered in our previous videos entitled Primary Tactics Suspected Racists Use according to the code, as well as More Tactics Suspected Racists Use, Part 2. I would suggest viewing those videos if you have not done so already. I have included links in the description. I think it would be best that we begin by giving the definition we use for the interchangeable terms racism and white supremacy, which is a global system of people who classify themselves as white and who are dedicated to the mistreatment and subjugation of all those they have classified as not white. Through the efforts of attempted counter-racists to solve the problem of the global system of white supremacy, racism, it has become evident that maintaining the system depends on those who practice racism, preventing their victims from learning what the system is and how it works. This is done through deception and confusion. There are many tactics used to cause confusion in the minds of victims of white supremacy that result in the inability of victims to understand and then solve the problem. The previously mentioned 6 racist strategies for causing confusion, as per the Counter-Racist Codebook, as written by Mr. Neely Fuller Jr., are racial classification confusion, racial population dislocation confusion, racial population tailoring confusion, racial showcasing confusion, racial sexual confusion, and racial white sacrifice confusion. Additional tactics and strategies used by white supremacists, racists that we have covered include lying, omitting information or racial omission, racial overspeak, victim blaming, feigning ignorance, feigning confusion, playing the victim, and racial guilting. Not only do we analyze these strategies in an effort to understand how those who classify themselves as white deceive their non-white victims and keep their victims in a state of confusion, but we attempt to offer constructive suggestions for minimizing the effects of these tactics. Counter-racism is a science that involves questioning the system or aspects of it, hypothesizing the effects, experimenting within the system, collecting and analyzing data we obtain through our experiments and experiences, as well as drawing conclusions that we think will lead to being able to ultimately solve the problem that is the global system of white supremacy, racism, without creating new problems. If you have studied the system of white supremacy, even vaguely, you may have noticed that tactics used by racist man, racist woman, and racist child are not limited to the previously mentioned strategies and tactics. What is the difference between the two? A strategy refers to the overall plan of action to achieve that which one desires, while tactics refer to the individual steps taken to carry out a strategy. Strategies involve long-term goals and require deep thought and the alignment of various function areas or aspects thereof. Tactics focus on the short-term execution of tasks and activities, with the focus being on improvement and efficiency. The code that those who classify themselves as white utilize involves refining their practices to maintain the system, improving it, and making it more efficient for the white supremacists. This means that their tactics and strategies evolve over time. Thus, additional strategies are used in addition to the 6 racist strategies for causing confusion, along with the tactics racists use to achieve the goals of these strategies. Some of these additional tactics and strategies that attempted counter-racists have encountered while attempting to counter the system of white supremacy are racial shadowboxing. In the code book, the revised edition, on page 137, Under Area 4, Labor, Mr. Fuller suggests that non-white people avoid racial shadowboxing. Racial shadowboxing is described as
when victims of racism, with meaning non-white people, people who are classified as non-white, are directly or indirectly assigned, bribed, coerced, or otherwise influenced by the white supremacists to speak and or act to do harm to other victims. Such speech or action can be described as racial shadowboxing.
Mr. Fuller further explains that white supremacists often hide behind others who they use as shadows of themselves. The intent is to cause the other victims of racism to believe, incorrectly, that it's the person acting in a shadow capacity who is the cause of the speech or action. For that reason, it is incorrect to speak or act against the victim, non-white person, who is used as a shadow for the racist white supremacists. In essence, racial shadowboxing refers to those who classify themselves as white instigating conflict between non-white people. This can be done not only directly or indirectly, but on a range of scales, from conflict between individual victims of racism to conflicts between large groups of non-white people. We've previously covered the primary racist strategy of racial showcasing confusion, the codified term used for when the white supremacists, racists, take large numbers of non-white people and put them out front, allowing non-white people to possess or to be associated with money and resources, places to live, accolades, and other comfortable and attractive things, are deliberate and skillful ways of causing confusion in the minds of non-white people. Other examples of racial showcasing confusion involve white people using their proximity to certain non-white people, such as when white people use non-white co-workers, spouses, offspring, etc., to make victims think a particular white person is not practicing racism because they have these close ties or tragic arrangements with their victims. Upon further analysis, it appears that racial showcasing confusion is a precursor to racial shadowboxing. White people putting non-white people out front creates a dynamic where the showcase victims are used as a shield from other victims. The tactic of racial shadowboxing deserves a more detailed analysis that we will plan to do in a future video. How do we avoid racial shadowboxing? Such suggestions as no contact, no conflict, victims guaranteed qualifications, or VGQ, and the 10 basic stops are all constructive practices of Black self-respect that can be used to minimize conflict between victims of racism, stop VORs from victim blaming other victims of racism, white supremacy, and can assist in avoiding the racist tactic of racial shadowboxing. Racial consumption. Racial consumption of non-white people refers to those who classify themselves as white, consuming the physical bodies of non-white people, as well as the energies of non-white people, when not engaging in actual cannibalism, and there is much documentation pointing to white people actually eating the flesh of their non-white victims. White people consume non-white bodies and energies in various ways. This includes laboring non-white people, sex with non-white people, and using non-white people for entertainment, or likening non-white people to food or other consumables, as well as using the remains of non-white people for alleged scientific study, and occupying non-white people's time and attention in ways that ultimately maintain the system of white supremacy racism and inhibit the production of a system of justice. A detailed history of how the tactic of racial consumption has been used against victims of white supremacy can be examined in the book entitled The Delectable Negro: Human Consumption and Homoeroticism Within U.S. Slave Culture by Vincent Woodard. I encourage you to read The Delectable Negro, but must caution you to be mentally prepared for the graphic descriptions contained within. In my opinion, The Delectable Negro is a must-read for anyone who is serious about understanding what racism is and how it works. To counter the tactic of racial consumption, victims of racism should be aware that racists love to waste non-white people's time and energy to keep victims from doing what they must to end the system of racism. Victims should do their best to ensure, as much as possible, that all their time and energy is being used towards ending white supremacy and producing a system of justice. Racial reframing. Racial reframing is a term JustaVOR uses to describe when white supremacists change or attempt to change the conceptual viewpoint in relation to which a situation is experienced so as to falsely make victims of racism, white supremacy, think racism is not being practiced. White supremacists, especially covert racists, are often trying to find alternative ways to get victims of racism to perceive ideas, events, or situations directly or indirectly connected to the system of white supremacy, and use the tactic of racial reframing to shape and design the way non-white people think, speak, and behave in response to the system. Some common examples of racial reframing would be when those who classify themselves as white make such statements as, "It's not about race, it's about class." "It's not about black versus white, it's about the rich versus the poor." And, "It's not racism, it's capitalism," or sexism, or politics, etc. To counter the tactic of racial reframing, VORs should use logic and keep in mind that the system of white supremacy racism is a global system that impacts all major areas of people's activities: economics, education, entertainment, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war/counter-war. Victims should keep in mind that the ultimate goal of the racist white supremacists is to maintain the system of white supremacy. If a victim suspects that racism is being practiced by a suspected white supremacist, it would be best that VORs behave as such and respond constructively. Conflation. Conflation refers to the mixing of two or more sets of information, ideas, text, or opinions into one. Racists will often use conflation to confuse their victims by merging information, ideas, and concepts with information, ideas, and concepts of racism, white supremacy. Racists will often use ideas surrounding other methods by which people are mistreated, such as sexism or anti-sex, income levels, and merge these concepts with the system of racism, white supremacy, in a manner that takes the primary focus off of the problem of racism, white supremacy. Racists will often use metaphors to make false comparisons between two or more things that do not actually equate. Conflation often leads to confusion and the racial consumption of the time and energy of victims of racism, non-white people. To counter efforts of conflation, one should keep the focus on the problem that is the system of white supremacy, racism. VORs should be aware that conflation often leads to the misrepresentation of information and thus produces errors and misunderstandings while obscuring the analysis of relationships which are emphasized by contrast. While racists will point to other methods of mistreatment and thus attempt to equate the mistreatment of white people under these methods, leading to white sacrifice confusion, to the mistreatment of non-white people under the global system of white supremacy, it should be kept in mind that those with the most power are the most responsible for everything happening under their watch. As Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. reminds us, racism has done more to produce non-justice than any other socio-material system known to have been produced or supported by the people of the known universe. Racial focal pointing. This term was coined by a frequent investor and caller of the Context of White Supremacy radio program hosted by Gus T. Renegade. The caller, going by the handle Retired Firefighter from Florida, used the term racial focal pointing to refer to when suspected racists, white supremacists, focus in and point to overt white supremacists such as the Ku Klux Klan or other white supremacists or so-called white nationalist organizations, as if only those white people associated with such groups can be racist white supremacists. To counter the tactic of racial focal pointing, VORs should remind themselves that the system of white supremacy, racism, requires that those who classify themselves as white mistreat those they've classified as not white, and that it is logical to think that any white person who can practice racism is a racist white supremacist. Asking the question, can a white person who is not a member of the KKK or other overt white supremacist organizations still be a white supremacist? Logic dictates that, yes, a so-called white person can be a white supremacist without belonging to any overt white supremacist organizations. Gaslighting. Gaslighting is a classic psychological manipulation tactic that racist white supremacists use to make victims of racism question themselves, their identity, their memory, perceptions, their reality, and their sanity by manipulating situations to instill doubt about what racism is and how it is practiced. Gaslighting involves lying, misdirection, insults, and criticisms. This tactic causes great confusion and victimizes the victim twice at once, as it is designed to make the victim think that they are crazy for recognizing what is actually a reality. To counter gaslighting by those who practice racism, victims should be aware of their situation, how gaslighting works, and any signs that they are being gaslit. Collecting evidence and getting others involved for support can expose the efforts of the racist to gaslight a particular victim of racism. Confronting the suspect to let them know that you are aware of their efforts to gaslight may cause them to cease their efforts, while walking away may be a constructive way of avoiding attempts to gaslight. One should be cautious that sometimes walking away is not an option, as one may be being gaslit by someone they are unable to avoid, such as a coworker, supervisor, or educator. Also, getting others involved, especially other victims who may be more confused or too afraid to speak out, may work against the victim being gaslit. Documenting the experiences and reporting them to those with the most power may be the best option in many cases, while utilizing a well-planned exit strategy to disconnect from the situation may be one's only constructive solution at the time. What other strategies or tactics do racists use against their non-white victims? And what methods should victims of racism use to counter these racist strategies and tactics? Feel free to leave your questions, comments, and concerns. For more information about the purpose and goals of this channel, as well as some basic definitions of words and terms we use in reference to our work, I have included a link below to a video containing this information. If you would like an even better understanding of the code and how it works, please visit producejustice.com to order the United Independent Compensatory Code System Concept by Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. There are many constructive suggestions for ending the system of white supremacy, and Mr. Fuller's code book and his word guide act as guides to getting and keeping on code. If you think this content is constructive and worth your time and energy, please subscribe and share to support the making of more content in the future. Much appreciation for all the VORs already subscribed. I am JustaVOR, and I am still learning. Thank you for watching. Until next time.
Let me say something that gets to the very crux of the matter, and this may be offensive for some to hear who are not on the side that we're on. White people, we have been the problem for 400 years.
Say that again.
Let me say it one more time for those of you who didn't hear me. White people, we have been